Good morning, homesteaders, gardeners, and cooks. I am making a snack today that is similar to Laura bars. The original recipe came from Saveur Magazine, and they called them sugar plums. The original recipe did not call for plums, and I thought it was funny to make something called sugar plums and not put plums in it, so I make them with plums or other dried fruit, but I'll walk you through the recipe. These are dried Italian plums, and they've actually been in this jar since 2017. So seriously long food storage on these. The nice thing about plums is they're dark, and so when they oxidize, you can't really tell. But they still have a little bit of bend to them. They've been in a sealed mason jar. That's all I did. I may have treated these with something like vitamin C. I can't remember. But what I'm going to do is measure out a cup of these. And I have a tendency when I dehydrate fruit, I often leave them in longer than they really need to be dried because I'm always so worried that there's going to be something in there that isn't dry enough and is going to mold when I have it in storage, which would be awful because it takes a lot of work to process all the fruit. And the last thing you want is to have it mold and then have to throw it out. And so I tend to over dry things more than they need to be. And so what I'm going to do, because these are too dry to easily chop in a food processor, which is what I'm going to do with this recipe, I am going to soak these in hot water for a half an hour or so, just to reconstitute them enough to where they're going to be easy to blend. And so I've got a cup of dried plums. I've also done this recipe with dried peaches and dried apricots. And so what you use is not super critical. It should just be something that you like. And then I'm going to add to this a cup of boiling water so that they're covered. They actually smell really good. And then I'm just going to put a lid on it, and I'm going to let this sit until those are soft. And I don't want them to be so soft that they're super gooey, but it'll take a half an hour is generally a good amount of time for these to soften up enough to where you can pretty easily chop them. So we'll be back in a few minutes. All right, we're back. I soaked these for about a half an hour, and then I did drain them just because I didn't want them. I had some other things I needed to do in terms of farm chores. I didn't want them to get too moist, but you can see these have plumped up a bit. There's a lot more flexibility in there, but I can still feel the dried core in the center. So they are not like fully rehydrated, just a lot softer than they were. I'm now going to toast, 2 cups of almonds. Almonds is pretty typical for most of these type of recipes, and you can Google, DIY Laura bars or other versions that are similar. They almost always have dates, but you can use different kinds of nuts. You don't have to use almonds. I happen to really like almonds, and so I'm going to go ahead and use almonds, but you could use whatever nut you had on hand. And this is a trick that I don't understand why more people don't do. I'm going to toast these in my toaster oven rather than putting them in a skillet or putting them in a whole oven and getting a whole oven hot for what's 2 cups of almonds. That just seems silly. This works great. I use it all the time. You do kind of need to get a feel for it. You can overcook things and burn them if you're not careful. And so there is a bit of a trick to knowing what your toaster oven should be set at. But this is a great, fast, hands-off way to toast nuts. Other things we're going to need in this recipe include dates. And almost all of these recipes include dates because dates are very sweet. And so it's a way of adding a sweetener without adding something that's wet. Plus, it just seems more natural, and we do love the idea of something natural. dates are super crazy sweet and sugary. So if you're on a low carb diet, this is clearly not what you want to do. I got these on sale. We have a local grocery store here that's a bit of a natural food store called Andy's. And these were in their sale rack. And so they look absolutely terrible, but they're going to be just fine by it. And I'm going to kind of break them up with my fingers because I'm going to need to be able to run these in a food processor. And I need a cup of dates. And I'm going to just weigh this because these are really hard to cram into a cup. Let me see if I can get some idea of a cup. That's 8 ounces is probably pretty close. And so I'm really just going to go by weight. There we go. So there's 8 ounces of dates. And there are many different kinds of dates out there, and it's not something I've heavily researched in terms of what varieties are best. So yeah, I don't really know the pros and cons of different kinds of dates in terms of sweetness or usability. It's not something I tend to eat out of hand. I don't love them just straight. So yeah, I just use whatever I happen to find. Some stores only have one variety. Some stores have 5 or 6. Other things I'm going to need in this recipe are some cinnamon, some allspice. You can use whatever spices you want, or you can leave it out altogether. This is what the original recipe used, and I happen to really like the flavor, and so it's what I continue to use. And then it calls for grated orange zest. I don't happen to have an orange on hand, and so I'm just going to use orange flavoring or orange extract in this recipe as a substitute for that. And then honey. I need a 1/4 cup of honey. This is local raw honey, but it also is somewhat crystallized. Raw honey, if you heat it, you kill all the benefits. I'm not worried about that right now. I just need to be able to get it easily out of the jar. And so I'm going to microwave this for a short period of time so that it's more fluid. Okay, so my nuts are lightly toasted. And I'm just going to leave that open so they cool off a bit. My honey is warmed up. I microwaved that for about a minute. You can see there's still a lot of crystallized honey on the bottom of that, so I'm going to actually try to stir that in and maybe heat it one more time. Not because it's going to be a problem in this recipe, but just because I want my honey to be fluid enough that I can actually get it out of here for future projects as well. You can put this in a very low heated water on the stove and do this the same way without a microwave. So basically take a pot, put some water in it, put the jar in the pot, and then just under very low heat, slowly heat it. Depending on how low your temperature is, that can take up to an hour to reconstitute that honey so it's no longer crystallized. I generally don't have the patience, which is why, as I said, I'm not overly worried about preserving every component of this raw honey. All right, first thing we're going to do is chop our almonds. And I'm going to use my food processor for this. I often have my nuts in the freezer when I'm not using them, just because they have oils that go rancid, and so it helps preserve them. This particular batch of almonds was at room temperature because I bought them the other day and knew I was going to be making this recipe. You might need a little longer toasting time if they're starting out frozen. All right, plug your ears. So there we have coarsely chopped almonds. You can go as fine or as coarse as you like here. I'm going to be throwing other things in here and continuing to grind this, and so I'm not going to go super fine right now. If you go too long, you end up making almond butter, which is definitely not the goal, but that usually takes a couple of minutes. So I'm going to throw in my plums and my dates. And these dates are super sticky. And so you really want to break this up, because otherwise you're going to end up with just wads of date on the blade of the food processor. Ask me how I know. I keep seeing these. See, that is part of a seed. I keep seeing these little white bits in here and figuring they're the part of the seed of the date, and that is indeed what that is. So somebody processed these and was a little bit careless in terms of, sometimes it's just the shell of the seed, but in some cases it seems to be the actual seed, and that's not good. We definitely don't want that in there. Most dates do not have this. That's maybe why these were reduced in price. I don't know. Oh my gosh, so sticky. It's basically like taffy. And you can see I'm grinding this in phases. In my experience, if you throw everything in at once, it's too much for the food processor to process, and so I'm doing it in pieces. And what I'm looking for here is evenly distributed. Yeah, that looks pretty good, actually. I'm going to do one more grind. And no big chunks. But again, you can leave it as chunky or as not chunky as you like. All right. That's probably about as good as that's going to get. This isn't the world's greatest food processor. And now I'm going to add in the rest of my ingredients. I'm sure a lot of you know this trick, but when you're working with honey or molasses or anything that's super sticky, and you're measuring it, if you put a little bit of oil in the measuring cup, it comes out super easy. And so a lot of times I'll look and see, like if a recipe calls for a half a cup of oil and a quarter cup of honey, I'll use a quarter cup and measure the oil, do 2, and then do the honey, just so that I've got a container that's coated with oil and I don't have to get a second one dirty. So you can see how lovely and liquid our honey is now. I'm going to try to spread this around so that it doesn't all just puddle directly in the bottom here. The lighting's not great, but can you see how that's just sheeting out of there? So look how clean that is. Really makes a difference in terms of not leaving, a tablespoon or more of your substance behind. I need 1.5 teaspoons of cinnamon. Half a teaspoon of allspice. Half a teaspoon of nutmeg. This calls for freshly ground. Freshly ground is much better, but it's also very fiddly. So I almost never do fresh. Call me lazy. And then I'm going to add a teaspoon of orange extract. The orange in this is really, really good. It's well worth doing. So, buy an orange and zest it. So in this particular recipe with this mix, I would suggest not skipping the orange. It really is fantastic. I am going to put a little bit of salt in this. It doesn't call for it, but I think it's a good idea. This is Redmond's real salt, and it tends to be just a tiny bit chunky. And I'm just putting a couple pinches in here. That's probably 1/8 of a teaspoon. Sweet things almost always benefit from just a little bit of salt to counter the sweet. All right, and we're going to remix this. All right, I'm going to poke that around just a little bit. Since I have this, I'm going to use this. And this is a little bit warm because those almonds were warm, which is probably not a bad thing for mixing. I just want to make sure that we don't have like a bunch of stuff that's not getting moved. This is very sticky, so if you don't have a good food processor, this is going to be tough. If you don't have a good food processor, I would do each individual piece in the processor and then put it all in a bowl to mix it by hand, rather than trying to get your food processor to do it. Yeah. I think I've exceeded what I can do here. So I'm putting this in a 7x11 pan. I'm going to just put a little bit of oil in the bottom of it so it doesn't stick. You could also use parchment paper. I've done that in the past as well. And then I'm just going to get everything into this pan and then wet my hands to pack it down. It's super sticky. Hands to get it out of here. All right. If you wanted these to be thicker, you could do this in an 8x8 pan. I've also done that. These are fairly caloric just because the almonds are a lot of calories, and so we tend to eat them in really small bites. You can also roll this. The original recipe called for rolling into small balls and then rolling in confectioner's sugar. It was meant originally as kind of a Christmas thing, which is why they were calling it sugar plums. I don't know how old this recipe is. It's really been around for a long time. But we do better with this as more of a bar or a little square, and it's a lot less fussy in terms of not rolling things out. And I don't worry too much about the moisture from my hands or the moisture from reconstituting the plums in this, because I tend to leave it sit out, and that moisture will pretty quickly evaporate. I've never had these mold from sitting out, and we tend to finish them off in about a week or so. So we will let that sit and cool and harden up a bit, and then I'll show you what it looks like when it's finished. All right, you guys, it's the following day, and you can see we've been picking at these already. But let me give you an idea of what these are like. So they come out pretty easy because we did grease this. It is easier if you put parchment paper in this, because then the whole thing lifts out, and I just was too lazy to do that. But you can see we've got this, and it does look a lot like a Larabar, so very similar in texture. It's a little bit soft because of the moisture that was in there from the fruit and from soaking the fruit, and then very easily breaks apart and just tastes delicious. They're really good. A really nice snack for a lunch or a backpack or hike, or just, a snack around the house. So there you go, tribe. Sugar plums, AKA do-it-yourself Larabars, AKA what to do with all the dried fruit that you put into your food dehydrator when you don't just want to eat it out of hand. Give this a try. It's a really great recipe.